Well, hello and welcome to another episode of More Perfect Marketing. It's David Baer here, and today we're going to be talking about a term I've heard a lot about. I even, went to Wikipedia and some more savvy websites to get some definitions of it. The term is demand generation. And as I was reading it, and understanding sort of what this new terminology, at least new to me, really means, I started thinking, oh, I've heard all of this before. I've encountered this. I remember, back in the 1960s, Rosser Reeves wrote a book about this stuff called Reality in Advertising. This isn't new. And yet there's so much new in terms of technology and the ability to automate and speed up the knowledge that we can gain from the data that's behind so much of our marketing, that demand generation marketing is really the new version of something that we've experienced in the past, and potentially new and improved version. But I still don't get the entire topic. And so I've invited on somebody who does, and who's going to be very kind and explain it to me in layman's terms so that I understand it, and hopefully you do too. So let's welcome Deanna Shimota, who is joining me from her company called Growth Mode Marketing. Deanna, welcome.
Thanks, David. It's so great to be here.
So I don't know, if everybody reacts when you use the term demand gen or demand generation the way that I just did, but we were talking before we hit record about what many business owners, small and large business owners, and certainly marketers understand in terms of how you grow a business. And a term that you said used to be all the rage, but is not necessarily as effective anymore: lead generation. I wonder if we can start by sort of talking about what the differences are between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think many marketers still think that lead generation and demand generation are interchangeable terms that basically are the same thing. In my opinion, they're very different approaches to marketing. And what I mean by that, like, lead generation is about trying to pull a prospect into your selling process. On the flip side, demand generation is about trying to build trust and loyalty with a prospect so that they actually invite you into their buying process. And the difference is kind of a push versus a pull. You want them to invite you into their process because the reality is 95% of your market at any given time is probably not in market and ready to buy right now. Even though your sales team will say, we need leads, we need them now. That usually happens when they're behind on revenue and they need to jumpstart some things. With lead generation, traditionally, I would say over the past many years, especially with marketing automation, that is what a lot of companies have done. They've put gates on their content, so putting forms out there and putting it, on the web so people can find you, and they come to your website and they want to see an ebook or a case study or a demo. They have to fill out a form. What happens then is that marketing often will pass that lead over to a sales development rep or a sales rep and ask them to follow up with them. The problem is you're putting a gate in front of content that you want your audience to read. And a lot of people are going to be detracted from that because they're looking at it and they're saying, I don't want to give you my information to read this. I'm going to go over to company XYZ. I can see what they're doing for content, and I don't have to provide information because they're afraid of a salesperson following up with them. They haven't actually raised their hand. And just because they're interested in your content and what you have to say doesn't mean they're interested in talking to a sales rep or being sold to right now. And so the whole premise around lead generation is, how do you uncover those leads that are ready now, which is really just that like 5% or less of your market that happen to be in a buying process and open to having those conversations. So what do you do with the other 95% of people that are not there yet? And that's where demand generation comes into play. And demand generation is really about building out a digital footprint that becomes your best salesperson. So you're putting content out there in all the places that your prospects happen to be hanging out, so it looks like you're everywhere, and you give them free access to this content so they can take themselves through their own buying journey, and they'll actually raise their hand when they're ready to buy, if they like what you're saying, if they've been following along and you've managed to build out kind of that brand loyalty and affinity before they were ready to buy. It makes the lead gen piece so much more effective because they're raising their hand instead of you chasing them constantly and trying to pull them into your sales process.
Okay. As you were talking about this, I was imagining, certainly how technology allows us to do this in a way that it certainly, wasn't possible before. And I'm thinking, how does this play out? What does it look like? Well, we have the capabilities of remarketing, retargeting, which I think is what you were sort of describing in terms of the showing up where those prospects are. I remember years ago, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, maybe even more at this point, I'm getting old. Somebody used the term invisible opt-in, which was really just a fancy marketing way of saying, remarketing or retargeting. Is there more to it than that, or is that sort of the general premise of how this plays out?
I would say there's more to it than that. I think a really good demand generation strategy starts with a solid content marketing foundation, meaning you've got to create really good content, but not just really good content. It's got to be content that's very targeted. So we like to recommend our clients that they are creating an ideal customer profile. And what you're doing with that ideal customer profile is you're basically identifying like these are the best fit type of clients that we want to attract. And when you go out and you talk to companies, a lot of times they'll mistake this for a buyer persona. It's different than a buyer persona because an ideal customer profile is about the types of companies, not the people within the buying decision process. And so you're looking at things, their size, their industry, but also what are the triggers within that organization that may make them ready to buy from you. And maybe it's organizational structure. Like, let's say this company is more likely to buy because they have a chief revenue officer in their organization, and niching down to that, and then developing the content very specifically for that ideal customer profile. So you're no longer creating content that's trying to talk to everybody out there that's in your total addressable market, because then you start to sound diluted and you don't stand out. But if you really focus that content in on that group to attract them, and you start to look at where are they hanging out and where do we put this content, the next layer on that is looking at, okay, what's on our website? How do we build out that content? Then looking at how do we build out content on owned channels? So that's doing things like social media, webinars, blog posts, podcasts, all those things that you can control the publication of that content, and then layering on third-party outlets. So how do you tap into other industry organizations and people's audiences that they've already built out? And so you're putting all this content out there, but you're also looking at the type of content that you're putting out there. And when I talk about demand generation, like the demand generation plan is how do you distribute that content to get it in front of? And if you look at like the 3 phases of the typical, marketing and sales funnel, 95% of those people are in the awareness stage. That's where you're trying to get in front of them, planting seeds. That's going to be really high level content, like best practices, tips, guides. You're not talking specifically about your product at this point because they're not interested in that. They don't want to be sold to. The other 5% of your audience that happens to be in market or pretty close to in market, the middle of the funnel is going to be the consideration stage. That's how do you cast a net to find them? So you start to talk about, product comparisons and why pick my company, because you want to make their consideration set. Because if it were like a big software purchase, for example, odds are they're only going to look at 2 to 3 vendors.
Mhm.
You want to be part of that, which means you had to do a good job at the awareness stage. And then that, bottom of the funnel stage, you need content that's really about, okay, I'm one of those 2 to 3 vendors they're evaluating. How do I demonstrate to them that we are the best choice? And the reason you want to get all of this content out there for them to be able to do, Gartner this past year published a report on the state of sales. And in it, they essentially said that they believe 80% of the research and decision process for B2B buyers is going to be digital. Now, we take that information in the way that we think about it. We're like, so basically, they're 80% through their decision before they're willing to talk to a sales rep, which means that sales rep only has influence in that last 20%. So you better make the consideration set, because if you don't, you're never going to be a part of that last 20% of the decision, because they've gone out there and they've done their research, and people just don't want to talk to a sales rep anymore. And this report from Gartner basically was saying, it's really accelerated in the last couple of years how people are buying and how different it is because of COVID, when suddenly people couldn't meet face to face. And everybody started working from home, and companies weren't prepared for that. So they didn't have the infrastructure to do it, but they had to keep selling. And so some of them, got ahead of the curve and they put really good content, and they were like, okay, our digital footprint has to be our best salesperson right now. And it worked. And all of us sitting at home working, were going and doing the research and found out, hey, I love this. I don't have to go sit through 4 meetings with an enterprise sales rep to buy this software. I can research it. I can watch online video demos. I can sometimes even see the pricing packages. Like, I can do all of this and kind of make my mind up. So at the end of the day, I only have to deal with that sales rep to negotiate on pricing and get that contract signed.
Okay, there was a lot there, and a few things that I wanted to circle back on. Obviously, we've been talking, or you've been talking over the last couple of minutes about B2B selling, and there's a very different psychology around the prospective buyer there than there is when you're selling to consumers. And a lot of what we're talking about, I think, is very specific to that situation, including the types of profiles you were talking about, the makeup of an organization that somebody might be selling to, the different roles, and maybe also the different motivations of the people who are in each of those roles. So there's a lot there. But before we get to that, I was thinking about a book that I read not too long ago by a guy named Daniel Pink called "To Sell is Human," I think. And in it, he talks about the story of a company called Atlassian. And I'm going to hope that you know this story or know their reputation here, because what you've described seems to me to be what he was talking about in his book. Atlassian doesn't have a sales force. They actually do all of their marketing, and maybe there is a lot more gating on their site as a result of this. I don't know. But when people are ready in the buying process, Atlassian has sort of, set things up so that they're ready to receive people who come in to say, I'm interested, to raise their hands. Is that a company or a reputation that you know about?
I certainly know about the company. I don't know, like, I haven't read the book, so
Yep.
I don't know probably as much as you do about it, but it certainly sounds like they've prescribed to this model of how do we bring people along on this journey, but work with the way they want to buy versus the way companies have traditionally sold.
Yeah. And as you said, it's very different in terms of the way that we want to behave as consumers. but it's also the resources that are available to us as consumers. So I mentioned Ross Reeves back in the 1960s. Well, we didn't have the ability as a consumer, whether it's a, business buyer or a consumer buyer, to do the kind of research and access the kind of information that we do now. And obviously that gives businesses who are selling a lot more opportunity to put a pretty face on what it is that they have to say, and the message that they have to put out there. And the structure of what you've described makes a ton of sense in the modern era.
Yeah. Well, and when we were talking before we hit record, I know you had said this doesn't sound like a new and novel concept. And I would agree with that. I don't think that anything that is being done on the demand gen front is necessarily a completely new approach to doing things. It's a little bit of a spin of, back once upon a time, we had to go buy lists, or lists weren't available to buy yet, I should say. So people had to fill out a form. So we had somebody to market to, right? Or we were worried about our competitors getting their hands on our valuable content, so we would gate it. Or we just needed leads to pass to sales. Like, those were all reasons why we started putting this content out there and we started asking for information. We don't need those things anymore because of the way that technology is advanced. One, it's so easy to go find contact information for individuals. So if you're doing it to build up your email list or your phone outreach list, you can buy those lists, you can scrape the web. There's all kinds of ways to get that information that once upon a time were not an option. If you're looking to hand leads to sales, I would, argue that if someone has not raised their hand and said, I am interested in buying, and you hand those leads over to sales just for the sake of having marketing qualified leads that get handed over to sales, you're going to have low sales cycles. You're going to have poor close rates. And ultimately, they're not going to be very good leads. And you hear this a lot of times from sales, like, the leads that marketing gives us are garbage. It's very frustrating as a marketer to get that feedback, because it's like, I'm just doing what you're asking. You're asking for leads. We're getting them to you. We've used lead scoring, so we've prioritized them. We know they're engaging with our content. But the miss there is, just because they're engaging with your content doesn't mean they're in market. And so there's a lot of time and money wasted by sales reps and companies chasing people that they're not going to convince to buy right now. And so it's really, it's not when you talk lead gen versus demand gen, it's truly not do I gate the content or don't I? It's how do we get more inbound leads to come into the fold? And it's not an overnight magic bullet. I mean, I get clients all the time that come to my agency who are like, help, we need leads. We need them yesterday. We've got big growth goals. Our private equity firm is breathing down our necks because we're not delivering. We're missing our targets. We need revenue now. I get that. The struggle is real, and as marketers, we go into panic mode and we're like, okay, let's put some email campaigns together. Let's, get some digital advertising out there. We're trying to bring leads in the door. But if the leads aren't going to close, they're garbage. It's a futile effort. And so demand gen is really like looking at how do you build out, not just uncovering the people that are ready today, but preparing the people that are going to be ready tomorrow to raise their hand and reach out to you. And there's some companies that for years have been doing it really well. I'll use HubSpot as an example. Most of us marketers know what HubSpot is. It's a marketing automation system that entered the market just for small companies, and today they work with companies of all sizes, and they're one of the leaders in the space, even though they weren't the first, because they had a really good content engine and they made a name for themselves.
And they have a mix of content, right? There's a lot of public content, a lot of in-depth content on their sites, but there's also a lot of gated stuff where they and this we use them as an example a lot when we're talking about lead capture and what's appropriate and what's not to collect at a certain point. And so I'm interested in your take on this, because if anybody has ever been to their website, you get a form to fill out in order to access a white paper that doesn't ask you, your email address, doesn't ask you your email address and your first name, doesn't ask your email address and first and last name, doesn't ask email, first, last, and cell phone, right? It asks probably a dozen or more questions, which is going
Yeah.
to scare off a lot of people. Is so from the demand gen perspective, is that very intentional?
I think, honestly, I think they're a little behind the curve. They've got to put forms on stuff, partly because that's how marketing automation works, and they're trying to demonstrate how their products work and show it. As someone who has hesitantly provided my information on those 12 questions to them, it's frustrating to download a piece of content. And a lot of times, I think this is common for people. You're like, all right, well, if this is good enough, I'll do it. And you get the piece and you're like, well, that was not worth providing my information. And now I have a sales rep calling me 3 times a day and 4 emails a day going out, and I'm maybe over exaggerating what the outreach is, but it immediately triggers some kind of outreach and ongoing emails, things like that. And I think that's where people are hesitant to provide their information anymore, because 1, I don't want the follow-up, and 2, if I don't think that this content is valuable after I provided my information, knowing the trade-off was I had to deal with my phone ringing off the hook, it turns me off.
Yeah.
I think there is still a place for gating things and having form collection, but in my opinion, let the content that is going to position your company and your products and services, as experts in the industry, as a really good product or service, as someone that we should do business with, give that content away freely and save the forms for a demo request and subscribing to your newsletter.
And again, I think that works quite well in the B2B space, particularly when, they are in the role of professional buyer and they know that they're going to be buying something. Oftentimes I think could play out, and this is not the space you operate in, but it could play out differently, particularly the emotional aspect of consumer purchase, where there's a lot more driven by emotion in terms of the purchase, as opposed to the the budget and the right fit and all of the kind of decision making that happens in B2B. So do you see it as a universal, or do you see this as sort of more effective or more appropriate in B2B space than B2C?
I think it's pretty universal. I mean, you certainly don't see forms as much on the B2B side. And if the intent of a company is to collect your information so I can continue to market the heck out of you, whether you're B2B or you're B2C, you can still do that, because with digital remarketing ads, you can keep putting content in front of them through the retargeting ads without ever requiring a form. So you're getting them to consume the content, and over time, if they like your unique point of view and your stance in the market, and you're speaking to the problems and challenges that they have and how to solve them, and they follow along, they're going to start to build some brand awareness and loyalty with you and be like, you know what, this is a company I want to work with because I like how they talk about things. A lot of buyers, consumer and B2B, will say that before they even know, the details of the product, really.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question. I don't know that I should be asking it or not, but I'm going to give you a chance to teach the other marketers who are listening, and business owners who are listening, a little bit about the economics of demand gen versus the economics of lead gen.
Mhm.
It's often an argument from businesses that I've worked with over the years, that collecting an email and being able to drip on somebody forever is virtually free compared to the cost or investment of advertising to somebody on an ongoing basis. And I imagine that there's a return on investment argument for the demand gen approach versus the lead gen approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question to probe at. I think in reality, nothing is free. To say it costs nothing to send emails, it costs money to purchase lists, it costs money to write and design these, whether you're outsourcing it or doing it yourself, your time is valuable as well. It costs money for the marketing automation, any other tools you have in your tech stack to do this. So it's not actually free, but you also have to think about, okay, if I'm getting all these leads and I'm having conversations with these people, or my sales reps are, and it's not ever going anywhere, or the close rates are really low, there's a cost associated with that too. And studies have shown that when you're doing strictly a lead gen model, where you're reaching out and you're trying to uncover that potentially 5% that might be in market right now, and you're pulling in leads who aren't necessarily in that 5%, but they're responding to your content by reading it and engaging in it, and you're chasing after it, that the customer acquisition costs are actually higher in the long term versus the person who raises their hand and says, I'm starting to evaluate solutions. I want to put you guys on my short list. Start, having this conversation with me because I want to find out what it would take to purchase from you. Those sales go a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
And I think anybody, like at least on the B2B side, you're making a big purchase decision. Like, let's say you're spending 100,000, 250,000. It's not uncommon for those deals to take 18 months to 3 years to close. Well, imagine if you cut that even just in half, how much more other things you can focus on versus chasing that one lead for months at a time. Now, if you're talking B2C, some of these things don't apply because you can convince someone to buy that isn't in market right now. I think of myself, it's not that uncommon for me to like see an ad for a new pair of shoes that I do not need, and 3 days later they arrive at my front door because it's a low commitment type of purchase, so it's a little different to look at B2C and, not think you can't change their mind. You can convince people with low cost, even B2B. It just depends on the level of investment. And I think the higher the investment, the more you need to kind of understand whether they're going to be convinced if they're not already in market.
Yeah. And buried in your response, I also heard a little bit about potential for retention of a client, and that cost, like how long are they going to stick around before they go shopping again? If you didn't set up the relationship or start off the relationship the right way. So it's clearly a much more involved difference than simply saying, well, yeah, the money that we're investing in paying for the tech stack to send out emails and the people to write them versus the ad costs and the people who are creating the content, right? It's a lot more involved than that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a whole strategy, and that doesn't mean, like I like to say lead gen is dead. I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek because the reality is, there are still tactics within there that it makes sense to do. But I think if you switch your thinking from, oh, I'm going to do lead gen and I'm going to go and find these people who are ready to buy right now and convert them all, versus I'm going to do demand gen. Demand gen is kind of like a 2-3 phased approach. It's okay, we're going to create demand, which I kind of chuckle at. Can you really create demand? I don't know if that's the right term for it.
Yeah.
It's more like helping people recognize that they have a need for something that was already a problem or an issue for them. Not, oh, I'm creating this thing that didn't exist that has no problem and I'm going to get all these raving fans for it.
Well, any regular listener of this podcast knows we quote or reference Eugene Schwartz quite a bit, who famously wrote in his book Breakthrough Advertising that you cannot create demand; that you have to go out and find it and put yourself in front of an existing demand. So, yeah, I
Right.
don't think
And
you can.
right. And so, when marketers use the term like we need to create demand, it's like there's an asterisk there. What it really means is we're trying to uncover the demand that was already there that maybe they didn't even know they, needed, or maybe they did. And then the other piece of it is how do you capture that demand? And that's where you get those people who are actually in market. How do you find them? How do you get them to raise their hand? How do you take advantage of all that work you did at the top of the funnel to drive them to the next phase of the funnel when they're ready? And and then how do you convert them into an actual client? And that's where the sales piece comes into play, is that final stage of they're evaluating, they're looking at their options. We're part of that consideration set. That's, the sales rep is having conversations now to hopefully convert it to a client.
So we're just about out of time, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to learn a little bit about who we've been listening to for the last half hour, and learn a little bit about what you and growth mode marketing specialize in. So do you want to give us a little info about your company?
Absolutely. So, Growth Mode Marketing is a B2B marketing agency. We specialize in demand generation marketing. So, we work with organizations that tend to be 10 million to 250 million in revenue with growth initiatives. A lot of times, that's going to be organizations that are private equity backed or have their first rounds of funding. And they're starting to look at what do we need to do to move the lever to achieve high growth. And that's where we come in and we talk to them about demand generation, kind of combined with how do you find leads now versus how do you build that long-term sustainable growth engine that can be the catalyst for that high growth that they're looking for.
And if somebody's interested in finding you guys online, where should they go?
Yeah. Well, you can certainly follow me, Deanna Shimota, on LinkedIn. I put a lot of thoughts and comments out there around demand generation and B2B marketing strategy in general. You can also check out our website at growthmodemarketing.com. And we'll be launching a podcast called The Demand Gen Fix in January 2023 that will be coming out pretty soon too.
Perfect. Well, we will be publishing this episode after that, so we will leave links to all three, to growthmodemarketing.com, to you on LinkedIn, as well as your upcoming podcast. So, Deanna Shimota, thank you so very much for hanging out with me. This has been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much, David. I enjoyed the conversation.
Indeed. Folks, you have been listening to More Perfect Marketing. If you know somebody else who could benefit from listening to the conversation you just heard, please, by all means, share it. In the meantime, my name is David Baer, and I'll look forward to seeing you back here again real soon on another episode. Take care.